to my channel. My name is Derek Maine, and I read and talk about books. I have not done a video in a while because I finished JR. I did a buddy read with Dan from the Weird Book Club. I don't know if we're going to do a video review of that or not. It's very difficult to do with JR because JR is covered so well and at a high level critically that, and then just this past season, the 2 month review, which is how I read it, I followed along with them um, as I read the book, which I highly recommend. The Invented Part and The Dreamed Part by Rodrigo Fresson, translated by Will Vanderheiden. That there's a season for each of those. That's out on Open Letter. I wish I had thought, I didn't know my mind was going to go here, or else I would have grabbed them. And as you know, I'm not going to edit because the only way that I've found that this is enjoyable for me is if I just press record. But those two seasons I highly recommend. They are incredible. I mean, the books, are fantastic, but it's such a complex work, and JR, very similar, obviously, that like having that guide the whole way is really helpful. But because of that, there's not a lot afterwards to really say. So I'd read that, and then I have about 40 pages left of Suttree by Cormac McCarthy. So I read two, well, two big ones in a sense back to back. Obviously, this is 460 pages compared to like 1,000. That's significantly different. But JR is all dialogue, so it like reads very fast, whereas this is very lush writing. So anyway, that's why I haven't made a video in a while. And I had read some other stuff that I'd read some shorter books that I didn't totally love, and then I finished the Not Yet 1 and 2 by Manuel Marrero from Expat. Those were tremendous, but it was like, it's a difficult thing to review in a sense, I definitely give it a high recommendation, but it's like jumping into a whole another world. Anyway, I feel like that would take like a mini series to review because it's dense, but also it like hints at all these other things and threads, and it's 2 volumes. And so anyway, I just don't feel like I'm ready for that. And I guess maybe JR and that like kind of, it's similar like that with both of them, where they're just so intense as far as like their girth, their length, the amount of ideas, that I feel like I'm in this weird in-between space where I want to talk critically about that type of stuff. And I'm not even worried about not having the language to talk critically or whatever. That doesn't bother me because that's like snobby jargon, insider gatekeeper stuff. Like, I can talk about something critically without knowing the specific jargon or without being a trained critic. But what I feel I don't have is sort of the time that I think would be necessary to dedicate to doing that kind of scholarship, because that's sort of what I think of it as, like scholarship, and I spend most of my time reading very much for enjoyment. This is fun. I don't watch TV, like I read. I'm addicted to literature. I watch readings, or I watch a couple other Leaf by Leaf and Orpheus and Paperbird, who um, uh, John N.R. Wayne is the newest one, the Metaphysical Musings. That's incredible. And then the Republic of Bad Taste is going to hopefully debut one, and I think his channel's gonna be great. Of course, Michael, from Knowledge Lost, who still uh, is blows me away when it comes to the translated lit stuff. That was my sole focus, if you remember this channel a year ago. Anyway, so my life revolves around that, but it's an enjoyable thing, and it's not something that feels like work, and sometimes scholarships can. So that's what those two sort of had in common, and that dovetails into tonight, which now I've rambled for 5 minutes and 45 seconds. But my review, I'm going to do a review of Suttree, which is a very intimidating thing to do. I am going to keep it pretty light, as is the way that I do stuff. I'm going to not go full head on. I'm going to avoid some of that like scholarship type stuff I was talking about, because I think Suttree does lend itself to more of, noticing some cool things and putting a couple of things together and then talking about its place, blah, 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 but without feeling necessarily like you have to, have a big thesis statement about it. But I decided to put it into 2 parts, because what I really want to do is just read from it, because it's the language of this thing that is so phenomenal. So I have some sections here marked out, and for the rest of this is not going to be a review. I'm going to read selections from Suttree by Cormac McCarthy, and I think I've got probably 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 8 or 9 of those. Many of them are short. Several of them just one sentence. A couple of them may be longer to a whole paragraph, but I think they're all worth it. I hope you'll stick with me. Obviously, it's not something you necessarily have to watch. Hopefully my volume is appropriate. My daughter's having a sleepover upstairs. I'm trying to be quiet. My wife is asleep. So these are the conditions with which I'm operating under, amongst others, of course. Selected readings from Suttree by Cormac McCarthy. Reading from the Vintage edition, page 153. How surely are the dead beyond death. Death is what the living carry with them, a state of dread, like some uncanny foretaste of a bitter memory. But the dead do not remember, and nothingness is not a curse, far from it. Page 157. That's where you're wrong, my friend. Everything's important. A man lives his life. He has to make that important. Whether he's a small town county sheriff or the president or a busted out bum. You might even understand that someday. I don't say you will, you might. Page 258. What do you think happened after you're dead? Don't nothing happen. You're dead. You told me once you believed in God. The old man waved his hand. Maybe, he said. I got no reason to think he believes in me. Oh, I'd like to see him for a minute if I could. What would you say to him? Well, I think I'd just tell him. I'd say, wait a minute. Wait just 1 minute before you start in on me. Before you say anything, there's just one thing I'd like to know. And he'll say, what's that? And then I'm going to ask him, what did you have me in that crap game down there for anyway? I couldn't put any part of it together. Suttree smiled. What do you think he'll say? The rag picker spat and wiped his mouth. I don't believe he can answer it, he said. I don't believe there is an answer. Page 283. He hiked up into the mountains. The season had gone before, some trees gone barren, none still green. He spent the night on a ledge above the river, and all night he could hear the ghost of Lundor trains, a liquid clicking and long shunt and clatter, and the jargon of old rusted trucks on rails long gone. The first few dawns half made him nauseous. He'd not seen one dead sober for so long. He sat in the cold gray light and watched, mummied up in his blanket. A small wind blew. A rack of clouds trowed across the east, grew mauve and yellow, and the sun came boring up. He was moved by the utter silence of it. He turned his back to the warmth. Yellow leaves were falling all through the forest, and the river was filled with them, shuttling and winking, golden leaves that rushed like poured coins in the tailwater, a perishable currency forever renewed. In an old grandfather time, a ballad transpired here, some love gone wrong, and a sable-tressed girl drowned in an ice cream pool where she was found with her hair spreading like ink on the cold and cobbled river floor. Ebbing in her bindings, languorous as a sea dream, looking up with eyes made huge by the water at the bellies of trout and the well of the brimpled world beyond. Page 354. And across the fire her hot eyes watched him, and she seemed half breathless in the things she did. He walked off down by the river with his flashlight, along the path, flicking the light into the dead water by the shore, where suckers lay on the bottom, old bottles furred with silt, pale moon-eyed shad and catatonia. He turned off the light and sat in the easy dark and listened to a rip in some rocky shoal, a gentle whispering in the reeds where the river ran. A figure came down from the fire and squatted in the grass and rose and went back. The willows at the far shore cut from the night a prospect of distant mountains dark against a paler sky. Half moon incandescent in her black galactic keyway, the heavens locked and wheeling. A sole star to the north, pale and constant, the old wanderer's beacon burning like a molten spike that tethered fast the small bear to the turning firmament. He closed his eyes and opened them and looked again. He was struck by the fidelity of this earth he inhabited, and he bore it sudden love. Page 363. He left downriver in the dark, the oars aboard, turning slowly in the current, jostling over the shoals. The cottonwoods went by like rows of bones. Come sunrise, he was drifting through peaceful farmland upon a river high and muddy. He went along past grazing cows, their cropping in the grass audible above the clank of their bells. They looked up surprised to see him there. The fields were spatched with beds of silt, and the shoreline brush wore shapes of wood and rags of paper all among the branches. He passed beneath a concrete bridge, and boys fishing called to him, but he did not look up. He sat in the skiff and held his hands in his lap, with the dark blood crusted on the upturned palms. His eyes beheld the country he was passing through, but did not mark it. He was a man with no plans for going back the way he'd come, nor telling any soul at all what he had seen. Page 366. He sat with his back to a tree and watched the storm move on over the city. Am I a monster? Are there monsters in me? And finally, page 372. But there are no absolutes in human misery, and things can always get worse. Only Suttree didn't say that.